Welcome, everybody. This is the sixth session and final session of the autumn series on light. And this has been a particularly successful series with a marvelous set of lectures and a very high attendance. So very pleased to see you. As you know, at the end of each series, we have a round table where we essentially review the papers that have been presented and then have a good long Q&A together with ourselves. What we're doing today is slightly different because we're actually inviting participants and colleagues from the building and lighting and architectural community to join in with us in our discussion. And because the aim of today's meeting is to discuss light with view to identifying the key issues with particular interest to red light starvation or light starvation as it bears on our health or as a health hazard in the built environment. So the meeting is going to begin with Betony with her courageous recap as usual, to recap over the 5 previous or more lectures. Then we'll follow that with a series of short talks from our guests. We have Max Gulhane, who's in slightly red environment there in the middle of the screen, from Regenerative Health in Australia. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning there. And then we have Stefan and James from Fosters and Partners, and we're very, very pleased to welcome Stefan and James and a number of their colleagues from the world-renowned architectural practice of Foster and Partners. Then Scott Zimmerman, we all know very well indeed, from Silas Inc. in the US. And then Ulysse Dormoy from Atrium Lighting will talk. So at this point, I'd like to invite Betony Adams, who works with us on our scientific communications and is a postdoctoral researcher at the Stellenbosch University, to attempt the task of recapping on all the talks.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. It's a real pleasure to be able to participate in this roundtable session, which I think promises to be a fascinating one. As Geoffrey said, my job is always a fairly impossible one of choosing 2 slides from each of the presentations over the course of the series, and I often end up choosing the most general slides. So if I've left anything out, please let us know in the discussion. And thank you so much to the presenters for their abstracts, which I've used for this summary. So our theme this autumn was a topical one, light and its impact on health. Over the course of the series, we explored the physics of photobiology and the potential therapeutic use of light from infrared to UV wavelengths. We also examined the evidence on the negative health effects caused by our reduced exposure to some wavelengths of light found in sunlight, and touched on the implications for our built environment and new environments such as space. So in the first session of the season, we dealt with the fundamentals of light and its interaction with biological matter. Dr. Michael Sifra took us through physical first principles to cellular outcomes. This included a primer on light as an electromagnetic wave and photon. Michael then took us through the various properties of light, including wavelength and bandwidth, irradiance versus fluence, pulse structure, coherence, polarization, and sample geometry. At the molecular scale, Michael then catalogued the different endogenous chromophores, or light reactive molecules, which include aromatic amino acids and nucleic acids, which absorb in the UV and near UV, hemoglobin and melanin, which absorb in the visible, and photoreceptors such as opsins and cryptochrome, and respiratory cytochromes that are relevant to red and near infrared responses. Michael then went on to clarify the different ways in which light can interact with matter, and these include fluorescence and phosphorescence, internal conversion and intersystem crossing, vibrational cooling, energy transfer, and photochemical routes such as electron transfer, bond scission, and bond formation. At the cellular level, he highlighted 2 broadly applicable pathways in which light plays a role, which is redox photochemistry, and mitochondrial modulation. And finally, he outlined some of the specialized mechanisms such as opsins, or light-gated channels, that are cell type restricted. He then finally went on to introduce concepts from the optics of tissue, such as transmission and scattering and diffraction, as well as some structural hypotheses, which include the potential cells as dielectric resonators and possibly neuronal waveguiding. And then he briefly introduced endogenous ultra-weak photon emission, which some of us will have heard talked about as biophotons. So after this very detailed physical introduction, Dr. Robert Fosbury took us from the microscopic to the telescopic, turning his attention to the origins of life in the universe and the long evolution of living organisms within this light environment. His presentation explored how the flow of energy and entropy shapes complexity across the universe, from the birth of stars to the metabolism of living cells. He began with the first light of the cosmic microwave background and the second light of stars, where they forged the elements, and he outlined how planets, molecules, and eventually life emerge as natural products of cosmic evolution. Bob drew parallels between stars and organisms. Both maintain long-lived metastability by exporting entropy. Stars do this through starlight, and life does it through heat. And both follow striking power law scaling relations that govern their longevity and evolution. Bob postulated that from a cosmological point of view, life and stars are dynamic heat engines, continually building complexity until equilibrium is reached. He then went into more detail about the role of light in life, and life, as he explained, thrives by exploiting sunlight. So it is very well established that visible sunlight drives photosynthesis to produce sugars that fuel metabolism. But a complementary pathway, which he called photometabolism, is now potentially emerging. Near-infrared photons penetrate living tissue and appear to act directly on mitochondria, boosting ATP production and supporting repair processes. And remarkably, as Bob explained, the peak of the solar photon flux, which is roughly 0.75 electron volts, coincides with the characteristic activation energies of metabolic reactions, which are around 0.6 to 0.7 electron volts. And this apparent metabolic Goldilocks zone suggests that life may have been tuned not only to visible sunlight, but also to the infrared band where the sun is brightest in photon flux per electron volt. After this very comprehensive first session, the second session turned to the effects of specific wavelengths, beginning with the shorter wavelength, higher energy side of the spectrum, which is UV and blue light. Professor Richard Weller took us through the details of his own exciting research into the health benefits of sunlight, in particular on cardiovascular health. He outlined the potential mechanism by which this effect is achieved, detailing how UV-induced release of nitric oxide from the skin may lead to blood pressure reduction and may account for the fall in cardiovascular deaths. Richard then addressed the question more broadly. Conventionally, medical approaches to sunlight have been dominated by concerns over skin cancer. However, as Richard pointed out, in white-skinned Northern European population, there is no evidence that sunlight shortens lifespan. In independent prospective epidemiological studies from Scandinavia and the UK, increased sun exposure actually correlates with reduced all-cause mortality. So cardiovascular mortality shows the biggest fall, but overall reductions in cancer deaths are also important, as this is such a highly prevalent cause of death. He then briefly introduced the ongoing research that is looking to identify the immunological mechanisms that are activated by UV, which might account for reductions in cancer deaths. He also outlined the role of skin color in UV light interactions and concluded that public health advice on sunlight needs to be reconsidered in view of the greater benefits than risks for sunlight exposure in a Northern European population. Our next session moved to the middle of the spectrum, highlighting the therapeutic use of green light. Professor Mohab Ibrahim took us through the fascinating evidence that green LED therapy may be a novel, non-invasive approach to pain modulation. Chronic pain represents a significant societal burden, surpassing in the US those of heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. And traditional treatments, unfortunately, suffer from side effects. What is interesting about the therapeutic application of green light, and what I've highlighted here, and what is somewhat of a departure from discussions about red light therapies, is that, as Mohab described, the mechanism involves the visual system rather than the skin, where the optic nerve transmits green light to central pain centers, resulting in analgesia and modulation of the endogenous opioid system and reduced neuroinflammation. So I've chosen to highlight this slide because I could not choose from the number of studies that Mohab presented, but I encourage you to read the relevant papers. He presented preclinical studies in rodents that demonstrate that green light LED exposure significantly increases pore withdrawal latency to noxious thermal stimuli compared to other wavelengths. He also presented new preclinical data indicating that green LED therapy decreases post-surgical pain, possibly by increasing endogenous opioids and mu opioid receptors in the spinal cord and rostral ventral medulla. Additionally, green light LED therapy lowers inflammatory cytokines and microglia activation, with sex-specific effects noted. Mohab also described how clinical validation demonstrates that green LED therapy reduces chronic pain in conditions like fibromyalgia and migraine, and improves functional capacity, including better sleep, exercise, and work performance. So from this practical angle, session 3 turned to hypothesis, with Professor Alistair Nunn asking the question, why green? Alistair outlined how life arose due to the propensity of matter to self-organize in order to dissipate energy potentials, and that he established that the key sources of energy were light, heat, and geochemistry. And from this, he suggested that photons from both thermal vents and the sun could have been important. The photonic smoking gun, as Alistair put it, is the electron transport chain, which contains multiple photon-absorbing molecules, including water, which can absorb from the ultraviolet to the infrared and can thus modulate electron flow and free radical generation. Alistair hypothesized that on the early Earth, due to high UV and free radical generation, life might not have started on the surface, but deeper in bodies of water in this photonic Goldilocks zone. In relation to photosynthesis, it is possible that anoxic rhodopsin-based systems evolved first, which absorbed strongly in the green, suggesting that the early Earth was purple, and this is why chlorophylls absorb best in the blue and red. Alistair then turned in more detail to the role that green light plays in mitochondrial function. Green-sensitive retinal-based opsins are key in vision, but can also modulate TRP channels and control calcium flux, which in turn modulates and is modulated by mitochondria. Alistair focused on complex 3 in the electron transport chain, which is also modulated by green light and appears to be a central controller of inflammation via a ROS-based mechanism. In the fourth session, discussion moved to the red end of the spectrum, where wavelengths are longer and energy lower. Dr. Ifi Kalempuka gave us a brief introduction to the fascinating research into light, extracellular vesicles, and grip strength that she is undertaking with the main speaker of this session, which was Professor Glenn Geoffrey. She also outlined some of the salient points of discussion that arose in this session and the series in general. So red near-infrared light energizes mitochondria, boosting ATP and recharging cells, but whereas long wavelengths enhance energy, it appears that blue light appears to suppress mitochondria. Timing is also important, with mitochondria active in the morning. And Ifi also explained just why Glenn's main focus of interest, which is the retina, is such a fruitful subject of study. The retina sees a 70% ATP reduction within a human lifespan, making it an excellent model by which to interrogate aging. Glenn then went into further detail about red and infrared starvation in modern life. A life evolved over billions of years under broad spectrum sunlight ranging from around 300 nanometers to 3,500 nanometers. As Glenn put it, this did not change significantly with firelight or when humans moved to the built environment, because incandescent light and firelight have a similar spectrum to sunlight. But this did change radically with the introduction of light-emitting diodes, whose spectrum is confined to visible light and tends to remove all the ultraviolet and infrared. Glenn then focused on how mitochondria that regulate metabolism and aging respond positively to infrared and are undermined by shorter wavelengths. These two wavelength ranges are in balance in sunlight, but with the move to LEDs, short wavelengths have become relatively dominant and undermine physiology. Glenn then presented data that documents how this exposure to longer wavelengths or incandescent lighting results in improvements in mitochondrial function, including animal aging, inflammation, and human vision, whereas exposure to short wavelengths results in mitochondrial and metabolic decline that can be measured functionally. He concluded that this issue is becoming a public health concern in the Western world, where populations are aging and people spend more than 90% of their time in the built environment. And as a countermeasure, simple changes to lighting may provide increased health spans in these situations at minimal cost. As we moved in session 5, the last session, from specific wavelengths to how these play out in our modern environment, Professor Alistair Nunn emphasized the fact that there is not a simple dichotomy between good and bad wavelengths of light. He outlined research into the effects of different wavelengths on the electron transport chain, and this research showed the effects of light in detail by using specific blockers of each complex, with each showing clear hormetic effects due to dose. Alistair reminded us that the true implications of light-matter interactions in biology are likely better understood as a biphasic hormetic one and a delicate balance between the different wavelengths. This was followed by our final presentation of the series by Dr. Roger Schwelt, who also emphasized the importance of the correct balance of wavelengths. As Roger put it, humans now live in an artificial light environment that is radically different from any other time in history. Our new technologies selectively strip out large portions of the sun's near-infrared spectrum while allowing more blue light, which profoundly changes the balance of wavelengths reaching our skin, eyes, and mitochondria. He then focused on how that altered environment affects health, with a particular emphasis on infrared light. He reviewed how near-infrared light penetrates deep into tissues and drives physiologic changes at the level of the mitochondrion, with particular relevance to melatonin, oxidative stress, and once again, the electron transport chain. He then examined how modern glazing and efficient lighting unintentionally removes much of this protective influence, even as we continue to receive visually bright circadian active light. Roger drew on a wealth of varied and really fascinating data from randomized clinical studies, emerging photobiomodulation research, epidemiology, and even historical evidence for the intersection of light and health. I haven't singled out any one particular of these studies, but I rather chose from the slides that beautifully showed just how profoundly our built environment filters out these infrared wavelengths. Roger then explored how this environmental mismatch may contribute to chronic cardiometabolic disease, immune dysregulation, and worse clinical outcomes. And finally, he considered practical ways to redesign homes, hospitals, and daily habits to restore a more physiologic, infrared-rich light environment while maintaining safety and energy efficiency. This brings me to the end of the summary. As you can see, the series was brimming with information, but as it progressed, some repeated questions emerged that we might take with us into the discussion. How do we assimilate the various information about wavelengths, e.g. red wavelengths versus blue wavelengths, and how do we fill in the gaps in our knowledge? And then do we make a distinction between a light for optimal health, which is rebalancing the spectrum that we are used to through lifestyle choices and modification to our built environment, and then light as therapy, which is using photobiomodulation to treat disease and chronic medical conditions to improve outcomes. And with that, it is my very great pleasure to briefly introduce the roundtable speakers. Speaking today are Dr. Max Gulhane, physician and health educator from Regenerative Health, and Professor Stefan Behling, who is a senior executive partner and head of studio at Foster & Partners, Scott Zimmerman, who is founder and CEO of Silas, Inc., Ulysse Dormoy, who's CEO at Atrium Lighting, and James Sherman, partner and environmental design analyst at Foster & Partners. With that, I'll hand over to our speakers.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the Guy Foundation for the opportunity to present. So I am a general practice registrar here in Byron Bay, New South Wales, Australia. And I'm going to share a couple of perspectives that I have had on this recent series, and really from the perspective of chronic disease and particularly metabolic disease causation and prevention, ideally. So this was beautifully recapped just now, but as many of you have presented and are aware of, that this massive part of the solar spectrum is in the non-visible longer wavelengths is having biologically active ways, which I think we're only reappreciating or appreciating from a scientific and metabolic perspective. Now, the role of this near-infrared light and its stimulatory and beneficial effects on mitochondrial metabolism are how I'm thinking at the moment, having a very relevant but constant effect on preserving metabolic health while a person or while a human is in the outdoor environment. And this was demonstrated, albeit in a narrow way or mechanism through Dr. Geoffrey's randomized trial in 24, showing that glucose lowering effect. And really, it's, I think, relevant that not only is this infrared light presence is assisting in mitochondrial metabolism, but it's also the correct circadian timing, and the fact that features such as insulin sensitivity, lipolysis, glucose metabolism, the activity of all the metabolic organs and processes in the body running on circadian timing, which again requires the appropriate balanced timing of blue melanopically stimulating light at the right time, contextually, with balanced with the near infrared and red spectrum. So, and as you can see, and obviously talked about by Dr. Fosbury, is this massive importance of the natural environment, which is reflecting that near infrared light for human consumption. Now, what are we having here in our modern built environments? And there's a lot to say about why this is human incompatible with optimal human health, but really, as emphasized, it is deprived of long wavelengths. It therefore is with a corollary of that, it's enriched in unchanging blue light, and this melanopic stimulation in the absence of change and variation through sunrise to sunset is again profoundly unnatural with respect to the human the circadian system, but also the eye system. So, there's multiple other aspects to why this system or this indoor environment is bad. I strongly suspect that the presence of radio frequency radiation, and although controversial in certain scientific circles, I believe that the animal data is quite compelling, and I think that's probably acting as an effect modifier or potential augmenting the negative effects, the energy depriving and circadian and mitochondrial disrupting effects of a constant isolated blue light that is essentially this environment, which is very detrimental to mitochondrial health. So the way that I really think about this at the moment is that the modern indoor LED lit environment is providing this continuous, you could say, hyperglycemic, hyperinsulinic pressure. And what I mean by that is, I think by depriving the mitochondrion of the longer wavelength light that is helping mitochondrial metabolism, we're actually lowering the threshold for the development of insulin resistance, for the development of metabolic dysfunction, type 2 diabetes, and therefore potentially in making the food, the diet, and the micronutrient carbohydrate content of the diet relatively more important than it would have historically been in someone existing out in full spectrum light. So, the converse is true, is that when we are in full spectrum light, we're getting this basal glucose lowering mitochondrial lubrication and coolant with respect to the melatonin near infrared features, and this is conducive to metabolic health and longevity optimization. I wanted to give a really quick, interesting, I guess, case study that I've come across, and these are the Tukisenta people in Papua New Guinea, and this was a investigation into their metabolic and cardiometabolic health from the 1970s, early 1973, and this group of subsistence agricultural farmers relies on the sweet potato for basically their entire diet, and they're 90% carbohydrate dietary intake. Very little protein, 25 grams perhaps per day. Pipe smoking was very common in this observed cohort of about 800 people over the age of 15, and it's in this central part of Papua New Guinea. So what did the authors note? They noted that the population was lean, physically fit, and in good nutritional state. There was no increase with age in mean blood pressure, serum cholesterol, fasting blood glucose, or adiposity. Glucose tolerance was high. There was a low prevalence of diagnosable cardiovascular diseases, hypertension, cerebral and peripheral vascular disease, and ischemic heart disease was rare, if not absent. So there's been said, especially from different dietary perspectives, about why this population has so little cardiometabolic disease, and those explanations I think are really missing the main thrust of the point here. And I believe that this is a population which is outside all the time, have prime circadian signals, have very enriched near-infrared and environment in the jungles of New Guinea, and their mitochondria are actually are operating optimally. And yes, they have dental decay, they have issues related to potentially that higher carbohydrate diet, but they are primarily metabolically healthy and insulin sensitive, which is I think what all of us are entitled to if we live outside and in accordance with our design specification. So the way that I'm thinking about this is that, as many of you have discussed as well, is that the modern built environment is really accelerating chronic disease and lowering the threshold for the development of chronic disease. And in the SPACE report, the Guy Foundation SPACE report, this great graph pictorially depicts this idea of what an accelerated aging phenotype is doing. And really, I think that the built environment, the indoor cubicle, the near infrared and red starved blue light enriched visible only lighting is a version of an induction of an accelerated aging phenotype, and getting ourselves out of that environment and back into natural sunlight is the absolute priority. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. So I think we'll then ask Stefan, actually, probably not to respond to that, but please, we're very much looking forward to hearing your contributions.
Look, it's a tough one, particularly after Betony's summary. I would say I've got nothing to add, because the only thing I could have said is what I've learned from Ulysse and Glenn and Bob and Scott over the last few years. But maybe I can add some different perspective, because I realize, you're all teachers and I can't teach teachers. But I think there is a challenge. There's a bridge to be built between let's call it practitioners, consumers, specifiers like us, and your incredible knowledge. Because as I'm not just saying it, I'm always feel extremely privileged to talk to some of you and learn, and I literally just learn. And on the other hand, I obviously we're fairly guilty, maybe for context, because bridge building, you probably actually have no idea who we are or what we do. We're architects, and we do relatively big buildings, well-known buildings. We're about 2,500 people in London, very big, prestigious projects, Apple's headquarters, Bloomberg's headquarters, airports. I mean, millions of square feet of working space, hopefully a little bit better than the offices that you showed. And I feel guilty. Well, maybe I feel we don't know enough. And maybe just as a tip of an iceberg, I think the architectural community doesn't know enough about everything that you guys know. And I personally have been very interested in lighting because I worked in theater and film before I even started in architecture. As a light, well, I would call myself a light carrying mule, schlepping lights through different film locations. But I did understand light and theater and drama and atmosphere, and that you can create the beautiful setting of a candlelight dinner with artificial lighting and a lot more than the actual candle, but you get the atmosphere, or I can create morning atmosphere or evening with artificial light. And we've done it, and I've personally done it a lot in projects. But what I hadn't actually understood is, and that came quite late in my career, is this whole thing of the circadian rhythm. And I possibly, learning again from a few of you, was on a side trip that we should make the light in our buildings follow the color temperatures of the outside to help people with a circadian rhythm. I've now had a lot of you telling me that's complete nonsense and it doesn't work. But as this is only going to be recorded and on YouTube, I would never admit that I was wrong. But I have learned a few lessons. But I think what is interesting is, if you take the two topics, it's yes, we spend too much time inside. First answer, get a dog. That could be the solution to the problem. But then if you assume that people are not all going to have a dog, and they will still spend 80 or 90% inside, there is a job to be done to give them the best and healthiest environment. And we had the benefit of working, or still have, with the most incredible clients. So Steve Jobs, we worked with him for 2 years. He wanted the best environment for his people. If I would have known way back then what I know now, we would have done it differently. We at that point, people didn't even have LED lights, and we were one of the first adopters of LED lighting. And it's in the building. But if I would have known now what I did know then, is so what is the cocktail of lights that we should put in those fittings? James is going to talk about it, and we're trying. I mean, Glenn has come and told us that we got it wrong again, but we are trying to put a cocktail of different LEDs in to get the right spectrum of light into spaces. And I think number one, on the lighting topic, I would love to have, or I would encourage all of you, maybe without being selfish, maybe for the whole trade of architecture, one needs to get very simple messages out of what are the negative effects of bad lighting and what are the benefits of good lighting, without losing extremely long words. And mitochondriac aging is borderline. But I think one needs to get things out that you can explain to a client. It's worthwhile doing your lighting differently to what you're doing right now. And we in our team, I said, I want all the research in the world where is there any smoking gun that proves it is bad for you. And the only thing that we, with our little teams, could find out is that there's lots of research, but we couldn't actually find the smoking gun that proves, look, I don't want to name drop, but these are, I know, very, very important people. You can just check out our clients, and we always deal with the top of the food chain in the client organizations. So these are people, they would buy the best light if they would know what the best light is. So at this moment, there is a very clear problem of, I would not know, James possibly knows because we're working together, but what do you buy and what is the argument why you should get this one? And that's my first plea, but it's not obviously telling you something you don't know. But I'd be super happy to help. We have contacts to everyone in the industry, but I still need an argument. And the next one goes with the windows and glazing. Again, Glenn, you started it off. We since then have spoken to different people in the glass industry. Yeah, I heard you, Geoffrey, just in the moments of introduction that one should have different glazing. We as Foster and partners have built thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of square meters of glass in buildings, but it is all been let's say driven by energy. Yeah, you try to do the most energy efficient glass building. Yeah, Apple Park, if you look at renders, it's 100% glass. But if you now look at it, maybe one could have had a different cocktail of coating. But to work specifically on what is the right cocktail of coating that lets the right amount of UV light through and lets the right amount of solar light through, but keeps the right balance. I mean, I saw a few of in your summary, you always talk about the Goldilocks, a little bit, but not too much. I think that would be an amazing piece of research, and I think one can just do it. Yeah.
Well, Stefan,
and basically my thing isn't a lecture. My thing is basically an offer with all your brain power. I think a lot of these things in today's world, I feel, is like connect the dots. If one connects the dot, one can actually get things moving pretty quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the offer. I think everybody on this call's ears have pricked up at that, and perhaps in response to some of your questions, Scott, can we ask you to present your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Stefan. You're basically, I think, was a great preempt to what I'm trying to talk about. But what I'd like to say is that we've had a series of things where Bob has dealt with the theory, and I've dealt with the theoretical side. Glenn's been doing stuff showing that there's experimentation, and Roger's showing practical implication. But one of the things, as the engineer in the crowd, one of the problems is we first have to be able to quantify some of these effects, like you were, and give you the proof that you need to convince your customers. So, what I'd like to talk about is how we can quantify the impact of LED lighting and displays, and look at the glazings, and try and essentially understand that on a quantitative level. Like I say, I'm the engineer at heart. But the first thing you have to do is look at I'd like to show the two graphs. The graph on the left is what people think about when they think about sunlight. And it shows this major peak in the visible, and there's not much going on in the infrared. But from a biological standpoint, we need to take a step back and get everybody in the same unit of measure, which I would argue is the electron volt. The biologists like it, and it's very easy to convert the spectrum on the left into terms of electron volts. And when you do, all of a sudden you see this amazing spike. And it was always funny. I found all these people that were doing it in solar simulators and solar cell work, and they always had this spike at about 0.075. And I was talking to Bob, and Bob said, well, of course, that's the H minus opacity window in the sun. Well, okay, great. That's one of the beauties of working with an astrophysicist. But what you see is that once you convert this thing into terms that biologists care about, which is the number of photons per second and what energy level those photons have, you see a massive shift in how you view sunlight. And through Marcus's equations, you can translate that into the basics of metabolic processes, which is electron transfer rates in all our different cellular parts. And lo and behold, if you look at that oval that I show in the top right is where most of the energy levels that most of the metabolic processes in the body occur, between 1.2 and 0.2 electron volts, or essentially 1 micron to 6 micron. So and then if you go down and you start thinking about how that impacts what we've done, the green in the graph is standard LED, 500 lux. The dashed line being the recent attempts to add a little bit of infrared in. And the red line in the middle is an incandescent bulb at 500 lux. And what you see is this massive amount of photons that are being generated by an incandescent bulb. And then the top one being the sunlight, assuming a black body, the sunlight is a black body. And the black lines are what happens when it gets through and filters through this whole thing because going through the atmosphere, water vapor and CO2 strongly absorb and creates these series of bands. So if you can go to the next slide, Betony. So if you do that and you look at all this stuff and you put everything in the same terms, all of a sudden you see this amazing coincidence. Not only does H minus from the sun translate into and align with the H band, what they call the H band, one of the peak areas of one of the windows, but you also start to see that the biological processes that are fundamental to metabolism seem to kind of line up inside these bins or these windows. Bear in mind that in these range of wavelengths, we have the highest transmission through the atmosphere. And what the astronomers did is they came up with some nomenclature, the history of which is kind of fun to look at. But anyway, it's I, Y, J, H, K, L, M, N, and Q. And what's really cool is that, it appears that one can make an argument that these biological or these redox reactions are taking advantage of what is transparency windows with high levels of photons, the peak level of photons per second, that align. And you could talk about what we call a photon-assisted Marcus equation, where the photons that we are in actually enhance the efficiency, not the changing the actual donor-acceptor number, but actually changing the vibronic state, what they call lambda, around it. So, and if you look at the table, you can see that it gives you an idea of how wavelength versus electron volt and its associated step kind of all align in a very nice, clean manner. Coincidence, maybe? I don't think so. Betony, if you can do the next slide. So, when you start looking at this, you have water vapor, which is defining all these bins or these bands, but then you also have the bands that are associated with sunlight. But then you also have to take into account that the body is essentially liquid water. So in the visible spectrum, there's good transmission. In the I band, which is most photobiomodulation occurs, which is from 750 to 900, or 700 to 900. We have the translucent nature of the skin or the body, as Bob has showed multiple times with some of his pictures. Photons penetrate deep and bounce around. But as you get out into beyond 1 micron, water starts to strongly absorb. And so what we end up with is a system that's kind of much more akin to what happens in the UV, where most of the body absorbs strongly and localizes all those photons, creating extremely high photon densities. So in general, you can basically say, and one of the things I'd like people to take away from this whole thing is that, what we end up needing to figure out on a quantitative level is to move from two-dimensional type thoughts, where we're talking about irradiance per meter squared, and start thinking about density, where we take the penetration characteristics optically, and you find that there is a huge, huge change in the amount of photon density, which then can be, if it is assisting in the actual redox reactions, as we believe, based on some of the data, it appears that what you've got is essentially a cladding of solar cell on the outside of our skin that is extracting as much work as it possibly can and distributing it out through the body. So if you look at within each of the bands, you see that the number of photons, there's photons everywhere in each one of these bands, essentially sunlight, incandescent, campfire, even to some extent saunas and things of that nature can actually fill up all these bands, which with a massive amount of photon density. But when you actually go to the next slide, Betony, look at it from the standpoint of the photon density, meters or millimeters cubic, or into the third power, or cubed, you get a better understanding that, you know, if I'm using this to enhance the capability of metabolic processes, it's the longer wavelengths that really, and if you look at the graph, you'll see that that's a log scale on the left. So it's a huge, massive amount of localization, just like the same thing that happens in the UV. UVB is absorbed within the outer 50 microns. Yeah, water has low absorption. Most of the absorption is in the proteins, lipids, and cholesterol. So you get an enhanced optical effect. The same thing appears to be happening in the longer wavelengths, but it's actually lined up with essentially enhancing the efficiency of the redox reactions or the electron transport chain, and maybe even defining why it is what it is. You can go to the next slide, Betony. So basically what I'd like to say is that I think what Stefan and the other, or what Roger and others have said, all saying, is we need to start quantifying some of these effects. We can. It's been a limitation for the industry in that we just now are getting spectrometers to make it out to 1,000 nanometers. What this is going on is 1,000 to 6,000 nanometers. And it kind of gives you a perspective of how little of the solar spectrum we can even measure or reasonably measure, but how much potential there is for making things better and getting a better idea of what being able to answer Stefan's question. Because at the end of the day, customer needs to be showed, here's the reason, here's the quantity, here's the effect. But to do that, we need to change how we look at sunlight as far as its unit of measure. We need to go in and think about how it's not just the photons incident in the body, but actually the density of photons in the body at what particular wavelength or the electric energy level. And, I'd like to end with this little thing just to give us a perspective. The comments about circadian. This is a graph that shows for a sweat monitor. What it shows is simultaneously measures cortisol and melatonin every 3 minutes simultaneously. And what it shows is I went to dinner with my wife, and you see the cortisol levels as we started eating. You can see the appetizer, then you can see the main course, and you see the things spiking up, cortisol's going up. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, melatonin spiked and then went back down, and cortisol was brought back into check. On the other side of the graph, we were watching TV at night and in the dark, and 10 lux was able to generate cortisol spikes, once you were sampling at a fast thing. So it is a matter of getting the measurement tools that we have, getting everything in the same units of measure, and bringing that all together, which I think can then have to answer Stefan's questions. So thank you.
Scott, thank you very much indeed. That's fascinating. If we can move on to Ulysse and then James. So Ulysse, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Geoffrey, Nina, and to the Guy Foundation for having me as part of the round table today. Very exciting. What I'm going to talk about is so unscientific, it's unbelievable. So there's going to be no bamboozling whatsoever. So I'm the CEO of Atrium Limited, a specialist lighting distributor working with architects and designers on projects predominantly in England. I've been in the industry for about 35 years, and I've watched it evolve from what I'd call an analog industry into a digital one. A little while back, probably 5-6 years ago, I was saying internally within the business that I thought that light today was sat somewhere between technology and health and well-being. Unfortunately, somebody said, prove it. And that led me down a path of curiosity. And actually, one of the first pieces of work that I came across was Scott's work on melatonin and the optics of the human body. And that really piqued my interest. And it sort of led me down this path, down this rabbit hole, which is really, I'm struggling to get out of, around the interaction between light and life. And through that process, I've been really lucky to spend time with Glenn, Bob, and Scott, who've all really contributed to expanding my horizons. And I've also been following Roger's work for about the last 4 years. And it really has been an absolutely mind-blowing, wonderful mind expansion. So having said all that, I realise that around, facing all, the science people in front of me, I'm technically part of the problem, but I also would like to be part of the solution. And that's really driven from the fact that, it's really difficult to unsee what we've seen and to unlearn what I've learned. And so really, what I'm going to talk about is nothing necessarily revolutionary, but probably sort of goes in line with some of the things that Max has been talking about. But essentially, we all know that all life has evolved under the full solar spectrum. Modern humans today spend 90% or more of their time indoors, and that means that we're away from natural light. The trajectory, in my mind, is one which is going to keep us more and more indoors. And really, it's a process that, for me, in my head, started with the first industrial revolution. And if we look at that in relative terms, in terms of how long modern Homo sapiens have been around, our modern indoor lifestyle accounts for about probably 0.09% of our time on Earth, as modern Homo sapiens. We chase convenience, and Dave Wallace and I talked about this a little while ago, and I think it's created a sort of a convenience conundrum. We try and develop safe environments, and we sort of we hibernate in them much more than we should do, and that's created a shift and a disconnect from the natural world and its benefits. As humans, we classify ourselves as the most intelligent species on the planet. We've understood photosynthesis for so many years, roughly, I think, 250 years. But we're only now starting to understand that that light, affects, human biology. And I think, for me, it's a fascinating time to be in, I'm going to say lighting, but I'm going to rephrase that and say that, to be connected with light. And it is truly fascinating, but I think over time we have reduced our understanding of light. We knew more about it 100 years ago than we do today, and that's a problem. We keep reducing our understanding. And within the natural world, there's an amazing circularity going on, and so many people don't see it. They don't. We take things for granted. We breathe out CO2. Plants take in CO2. They send us back oxygen. We breathe in oxygen. But then beyond that, we're starting to get this understanding that there's another pathway, which is the infrared pathway, and how plants reflect infrared beautifully. And we take that in. We need it. We use it. Then we talk about the built environment. And Stefan, very kindly brought the subject up of glazing. And so this is not a lighting problem; it's a light problem. And lighting plays a part, but glazing plays a part at the same time. And we need to try and think about how design can be used in a strategic fashion to make use of the natural world, to allow some of the longer wavelengths to come back into the built environment naturally, and also potentially to we need to try and find solutions within the artificial lighting environment. I think Max, was it Max that you mentioned the term? No, I think it was actually Betony, you're recounting something that Roger had said about evolutionary mismatch. If I remember rightly from your opening, the statement evolutionary environmental mismatch, I think, is really quite a clear one. Technically speaking, our physiology hasn't adapted. It hasn't evolved to spend so much time under artificial light sources. And I'd say that we're living these ultra-processed lives, and we've contextualized ultra-processed with nutrition, but I think it's equally applicable to transport systems and then on to things like artificial light. I see light as nourishment, and if I consume fast food as an example, I know I'm going to be hungry about half an hour later. It happens every time. I love a McDonald's. I'm not going to deny that, but I'm hungry again. And I think part of that is because I've been fed, but I've not been nourished. And just like fast food, I would say that artificial light today is doing the same for us as humans. We are being fed, but we're not being nourished. And then the other crazy thing that comes about is that we've also reduced our metrics of light for humans to a metric related to vision. We talk about lux and lumens. When we light plants in indoor environments or even in greenhouses, we give them PPFD, photosynthetic photon flux density, which is an energetic value of light. And we give plants energetic values of light because we want them to be productive. We want them to grow. Don't we want the same thing for humans? But yet we've narrowed it down to just the visible part of the spectrum. We've narrowed down our understanding of light to just being a visual aid, and that for me is a problem. And it becomes an even bigger problem, and I think it was Stefan who was talking about joining dots together. Global populations are aging. The IMF released a study earlier on this year, their World Economic Outlook, and it clearly shows that the world population is aging. If the world population is aging, then theoretically, and this is what goes on in my mind, we're going to be probably working later on in life. If we're going to be working later on in life, then surely we need to have more youthful productivity levels to be able to keep things going. The UK, as an example, is about to become a super age society either next year or the year after, where is it 20 or 25% of the population is going to be 65 or over. So we have a sort of a responsibility in a certain sense to ensure that people are remaining healthy. And just as Max showed earlier, Alistair's graph of morbidity expansion and morbidity compression, the built environment can play a significant part in that, and light equally plays a massive part. Is it a technological challenge? I think to a certain degree, yes, there are some technological challenges, but when it comes to lighting and artificial light, the biggest challenge at the moment is legislative, because we're chasing lumens for what? All the time. We want energy efficiency all the time. We are seeking environmental sustainability goals without even thinking about the impact on human sustainability. And I think that's also quite a big problem. And as I say, it's not a lighting problem, it's a light problem. We use light, we understand its power in therapeutic applications. Shouldn't we also be thinking about it in a preventative sense so that we don't have to use the therapy quite so much later on in life? We know, we've heard, especially from the team at the Guy Foundation, about the challenges that happen on the space station. My question is, how different is a space station to our modern office environments? And I'd say they're probably not that different in reality. So the only difference that we have against somebody on the space station, we have a choice. We can step outside. Who was it who was talking about getting a dog? Was that Stefan? No. Or was that Max? Anyway, someone was talking about, I think it was Stefan who was talking about getting a dog. We have a choice that the astronauts don't have, but we can see accelerated mitochondrial aging in the astronauts. Maybe those moments when we step outside make the difference. I don't know if anyone can see, but I've got this little button here. This is my little Ulysse button, which has 11 measurement points, and it goes into the near infrared zone as well. I took some measurements. First set of data that I've chosen to take from it. A day at the weekend where we did a 3 to 4 hour walk outside versus a gloomy indoor day where I didn't leave the office at all. My infrared consumption on the gloomy indoor day was at 0.57% of the day at the weekend. That's the differential that we're seeing with the built environment. So when we come back to architecture and design, I think there should be a priority to design for positive human outcomes. Embracing concepts like sort of biophilic and salutogenic principles, and not necessarily as a luxury, but as a necessity, because again, we need to drive human sustainability in parallel to the environmental piece. And light is not just for vision; it is for our health. So that's me.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. And back to the architects again in terms of what are you going to do about that? James.
Thanks a lot, Geoffrey, and thanks to everyone for sharing all of your incredible knowledge. I suppose I come at this topic from the perspective of a designer. And so for that reason, possibly other designers who are considering integrating near-infrared light into interior spaces might find what I'm about to say the most interesting, but I hope it'll also be interesting for all the other members of the panel and who are listening to this. I thought I would start with a brief description of one of our projects where we've tried to integrate near-infrared light into an interior space, because it's been highly instructive for us. Actually, Stefan, who sat next to me, is the one who kind of challenged us to think outside the box. The project I'm going to describe to you very briefly, because I actually want to focus mostly on the learnings that we had from that project, is in our own office. So we're sat in a meeting room here, and just across the way, we're looking at it now, is the main building of our office here in Battersea in London. And we undertook a project a little while back to refurbish the main space that we all sit in every day and that we bring all of our clients to. It really is the kind of centerpiece of Foster and Partners and the F&P experience. And it's kind of undergoing a large retrofit right now to refresh a lot of the interior finishes and to, kind of uplift the space in a bunch of different ways. But lighting was going to be part of that. And initially what we had thought was we were just going to replace these old fluorescent lamps, which we had in our ceiling, to LED lamps, and possibly get a little bit more operation out of them with some different color temperatures and be able to get a little bit more flexibility in how the office was presented to both ourselves and to our clients, our visitors. But Stefan was the one who said, well, is that really the best we can do? Is that the best light that we can provide for people working in that space? And that sort of sent us back to the drawing board. And actually, in talking with a number of people in this panel, including Ulysse, who was a very valuable partner in this exercise, we conceived of a new way to light the office, which incorporated both elements of near-infrared spectrum and also blue light. And so what we're doing is we're kind of retrofitting our existing lamps to incorporate 4 different channels of light. And we've heard, as Stefan mentioned, from some of the amazing researchers who are part of this session, that might not even be enough. But we thought, okay, we're going to take that step and use it as a learning opportunity to see what we can learn from this. And so we've incorporated an 850 nanometer near-infrared LED source into that. It's just about to be finished, actually, probably in the next month or so. We're going to be able to start taking measurements and start really understanding what it is we're able to provide with that particular solution. But enough of the summary. I think what I really want to focus on is what we learned through that process. So the first thing we learned is that there are plentiful near-infrared LED sources available. And actually, lighting suppliers are quite confident in utilizing those because they perform in much the same way as visible LED light sources. So in all the manufacturers that we spoke with, there really wasn't much trepidation to using LED sources for producing near-infrared light. Now, I know a number of people on this panel believe quite strongly that LED sources may not be the best sources for producing near-infrared light, that in fact, filament or glowing light sources may actually be preferential. But one of the things we noticed, and this is perhaps one of the barriers to integrating broad spectrum near-infrared light emission in interior spaces, is that modern LED manufacturers just are not very comfortable with integrating filaments into their products. So that could be a potential barrier. Secondly, if you incorporate a bunch of different LED sources into a light fixture, that's not the end of the story. You also need to control those. You need to provide power to all of those. And one of the big barriers that we found so far is that manufacturers of other components that go along with lighting systems, like power supplies or what we call LED drivers, are just not ready to provide drivers that drive many different channels of light within a single light fixture. We see early indications that this is probably going to change next year. There are already some really exciting products coming out which might allow this a little bit more easily, but they're not available yet. So currently, the solutions are quite inefficient. You end up having 3 or 4 power supplies to drive a single light fixture just because you need enough channels of different control for those LED sources. And then finally, control systems are the thing that ultimately are installed in the building and that govern how all the lights are functioning at any time. And many of you may be familiar that in Europe, the predominant control methodology is called the Digital Addressable Lighting Interface, or DALI, which is predominantly the systems that are used throughout projects in Europe. And that system just doesn't take account of any light which is non-visible. So anytime you add non-visible light sources to your mix in a light fixture, you have to effectively kind of trick the control system into controlling those light sources, which it doesn't understand natively, which also involves a certain inefficiency. So you end up needing more controllers, and that's more cost and more material. So at the moment, there just isn't a lot of support for these kind of light sources in that way. And then from a designer perspective, designers really love being able to calculate and predict what they're going to get. But a lot of common tools, software tools that lighting designers use in our industry simply don't make use of near-infrared light as part of the calculation that they allow. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. In fact, our group has been hunting for quite a while now to try to find softwares which do accomplish this. And there are softwares out there that do. And one of the things that our multidisciplinary team is so good at is also building, kind of customized tools around unique capabilities that we want to achieve. And we've been doing that as well. But a lot of these tools that exist only in research scenarios. So there are tools like Radiance or Spios, which is a tool made by ANSYS, which are used heavily in research and in really targeted design of, say, automotive lighting or other kind of very niche aspects of lighting, but definitely not used and not really understood well in architectural lighting. And then finally, I'll just touch on something that Ulysse mentioned, which is regulation. One of the biggest barriers to incorporating any non-visible light into an interior space is current regulation that has been driven by primarily energy efficiency. As I'm sure you will understand, any energy that you use to produce light which is non-visible is inherently understood these days as energy inefficiency, because we're so focused on providing light for people to see, for tasks, for navigation, for other things. And any energy spent outside of that is considered to be wasteful. So we absolutely need to reorient, policymakers to understand what Ulysse was mentioning earlier about the beneficial impacts of spending energy in this way. And I know there are a number of people on the panel. I see Glenn and Bob and others who are very passionate about this topic. So I'm not, this is nothing new from me, but I just want to highlight that as a topic potentially for future discussion or for discussion in the next phase. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
James, thank you very much indeed. Well, what a fascinating hour and 12 minutes we've had.